For almost 3 months, the two men who walked away from Trig Point Beach on a night in November 1965 thought they had gotten away with murder. Then they were undone by another crime. The three Beaumont children vanished from Glenelg on January the 26th, 1966. They were almost certainly abducted, but at first the belief was that they had met some accident, buried by sand they could have been digging in, washed out to sea by a riptide, or drowned while swimming. Searches involving hundreds of people took place at many spots along the coast in search of any remains which could solve the puzzle of their disappearance. 20 kilometres south of Glenelg, just past the mouth of the Onkaparinga River at Port Noarlunga, is Trig Point. Today it is part of the Adelaide suburbs, but back in 1966 it was still considered rural. The drive-in theatre at nearby Christie's Beach was listed with the country drive-ins on the amusements page of the Adelaide Advertiser newspaper. It was isolated, with a few but not many people residing in the area, but relatively close to the city. A similar and as yet unsolved murder took place just a couple of miles south several years after the killing at Trig Point. On January the 29th, 1966, two young girl students were on the beach when they decided to explore to see if they could find any trace of the Beaumonts. Where the cliff met the beach, they discovered a small hollow like a cave that had been dug out. One of the girls checked and found a body. Not the body of a child, but the decomposing body of a naked, tattooed man. Police investigating soon realised the man had been shot 3 times in the head with .22 caliber bullets. The body had deteriorated, but enough of the fingerprint ridges remained in secondary layers of skin on 3 of the fingers of the man's left hand for fingerprints to be lifted and matched. The sand was sifted and investigators recovered some hair, a small white button with thread attached, 2 .22 caliber spent cartridge cases, and a piece of metal thought to be from a lead projectile. The man was identified as Keith Ross Pascoe, aged 27. A tattoo on his right hand of a split heart with "Love Chris" on it, and his dentures, which had been repaired at Yatala Prison, confirmed the identification. Keith, from Broken Hill, was well known to police. He'd been arrested many times since his first conviction when he was 13 in 1951. Pascoe had about 65 convictions in New South Wales and South Australia for theft, break and enter, illegal use of a motor vehicle, forgery and uttering, larceny, and indecent assault of both males and females. He had moved to Adelaide around 1959. He had been set free from Yatala Labour Prison on November the 4th, just 6 days before his death, on or about November the 10th, 1965. In Yatala at the same time were 3 other young men. Peter Hepburn, born in 1940, who legally changed his name to Robert James Young in October 1965 after his release, and brothers Lyle and Errol Radden. Errol Radden was down on the floor being kicked by a prison warder when Hepburn assaulted the warder to save Errol. After this he got to know Lyle Owen Radden, who was 2 years his junior. After both had been released, Hepburn, now known as Young, but often referred to by his friends as Little Peter, telephoned Radden, and the 2 men met at a coffee lounge in Pirrie Street in Adelaide. Young said he was lonely and that he didn't know anybody in Adelaide, and asked if he could stay with Radden, who lived with his family at Colonel Light Gardens. Knowing what he had done to help Errol, the Radden boy's mother agreed that he could stay with them. Young claimed he wanted to go straight, buy a car, find a job, and a good woman. During this time, Young met another young man named Maurice Polflanders, whose father owned a .22 caliber rifle. Maris, who was in Yatala prison by the time of the trial for the Trig Beach murder, testified that he had borrowed his father's weapon and put it in Young's car after they had agreed to go to Sydney together. Pascoe had gone to live in a boarding house in Gladstone Road, Mile End. Little is known of what Pascoe did during his brief period of liberty. He was seen 2 or 3 times in a barber's shop at the corner of South Road and what is now Donald Bradman Drive, then Rowlands Road, where Robert Young worked casually as a hairdresser. Pascoe had purchased some darts from the shop. Young said to the girl who sold the darts, "Give him a good set. He's a friend of mine." There was evidence that Pascoe had gone out the night before the murder with a spade. Where he went and what he did isn't known, but later among his effects was found a map with the town of Willunga, south of Trig Beach, circled, and a line pointing out to sea and another pencil mark made about where Selleck's Beach was. At about 9:30 p.m. on the night of the murder, Mrs. Hall, who operated the boarding house, answered a ring at her doorbell. Upon opening the door, she encountered a young man with brown eyes, with, as she described, laughter in them. He asked for Keith. Apparently expecting his caller, Keith came out of his room and called back, "I'll get the spade and I'll be right with you." Later in court, Mrs. Hall identified that caller as Robert James Young. Radin claimed that this night was the first time he had met Pascoe, not having met him in prison. Young, Pascoe and Lyle Radin drove through the night to Trig Point Beach. Radin later testified that he wondered about the spade in the car, but didn't ask, as Young often avoided answering questions and liked to keep people guessing about things. The trio arrived and made their way down makeshift steps on the cliff face to the beach. Young handed the spade to Pascoe, who started to dig what was soon to become his own grave. The mystery of the case is why they were digging. A friend of Radin's, called Buff Heffernan, later claimed Pascoe believed they were there to bury a stolen safe. When asked if Pascoe had thought to ask to see the safe, Heffernan responded that Pascoe was pretty stupid. He said Radin had told him this, but Radin denied it in court, saying maybe a friend of Young's, Peter Dawson, known as Big Peter, may have said that. Buffett also stated that one of the Peters had spoken about the killing before they went to Sydney. It was conjectured later, but never confirmed, that Pascoe was aware of something hidden somewhere on the south coast, and that he was misleading Young as to the whereabouts. While Pascoe dug, Young went back up the cliff to the car and retrieved the rifle he had used in the incident in Frederick Street. He stood atop the cliff and fired a shot into Pascoe. The only sound Pascoe made when shot was an exclamation of, "Oh." Then he went down to the beach and fired 2 more times into the stricken man's head. He picked up the body and got Radin to help him to remove Pascoe's clothing and then drag it over to the makeshift grave. Pascoe was still breathing as he was roughly dropped into the hole, his head hitting rocks at the bottom, causing blood to spray over Radin. Then spadefuls of sand were thrown over him, burying him alive. The clothes were said to be burnt, but the ashes were not located during the investigation. Ominously, Young remarked to Radin, "Now you know what I'm like." Radin said that he acted out of fear of what Young may do to him or his family in going along with the killing and keeping quiet about it. He claimed that Young had sent him several letters, all of which contained threats against his life. He said he never knew why Young had murdered Pascoe. An incident occurred in Frederick Street, a small dead-end street in North Adelaide, not far from the Old Lion Hotel, about a week after the murder, which would later provide forensic evidence to help convict the Trig Beach killers. A Mrs. Bennett lived on one side of the street at number 18, and a family named Johnson on the other side. Mrs. Bennett's sister, Marlene Elliott, had met Young, whom she knew as Little Peter, and had previously brought him to meet her sister. Later on the night of the 19th of November, 1965, Marlene, who had been drinking beer and rum and cokes all afternoon at the Gresham Hotel, arrived at the Johnson house with 4 men: Albie Kyle, John Kelly, John Horn, and Colin Hall, celebrating the discharge of one of their mates from the army, and the group continued drinking. During the drinking session, a fight began between 4 of the men, Albie Kyle and John Kelly, with Peter Dawson and James Young. In the street, Young produced 2 cutthroat razors from his pockets, one in each hand. In response, Kyle pulled 2 pickets off of a nearby fence to use as weapons. When he did this, another of the men, John Horn, heard Young say, "Righto, I'll go and get a gun," and he ran off toward Melbourne Street, while everybody else returned inside the house. About 15 minutes later, Young turned up at the front door and asked Marlene about money she had stolen from his mate, Big Peter Dawson. Marlene rebuked him, stating that Peter had loaned her £1. Young asked if he could come in. Marlene replied that as it was not her house, it was not for her to say. She turned and started walking away from him up the passageway when she heard a gunshot and a bullet whiz past her and hit the wall. Turning around, she saw he had entered the house holding a rifle. Marlene retreated to the kitchen, followed by Young, who fired a second shot in the kitchen. While Big Peter attempted to take the gun away from Young, Marlene ran out of the house and went to a telephone box to call police. Returning to the house, she found Young outside and swore at him. His response was to hit her in the face, prompting her to flee back to the telephone box and urge the police again to come. Somebody yelled the police were coming, and Young left the scene. Mrs. Hall, whom Keith Pascoe had boarded with, received 3 strange visits soon after the murder. A young woman, who was never identified, came asking for Keith one day. She returned a few days later and announced that Keith was in hospital in Broken Hill and would need his coat when he got out. Mrs. Hall did not give the woman the coat, and she went away. Then in January, a man arrived claiming to be Rex Pascoe, Keith's brother, and asking for the same coat. When asked how Keith was, he informed Mrs. Hall that Keith was in a Melbourne hospital, in plaster. Why the coat, or whatever was in the coat, was so important was never established. Young had been making plans to leave South Australia, talking to at least 2 other men about travelling with him. Following the murder, he and Peter Dawson moved to Sydney, living at Coogee. Young then went to Melbourne and was living in Alma Road, St Kilda East, when arrested. Radden remained in South Australia, the weight of guilt heavy upon him. One day he was drinking in the Royal Hotel Torrensville with 2 brothers named Ian and Brian Morant. Brian noticed that Radden looked sad and didn't seem too good. Radden replied, "I'm mixed up in a shooting. This fellow had something on me, and he's been shot and thrown in the bushes. The cops will find out about it one day." The brothers swore and told Radden they didn't want to know any more about it. Another mate of Radden's claimed that he was at Radden's home discussing the news after the body had been discovered at Trig Beach, when he was told that Peter had shot the guy. Once investigators were aware of the identity of the murdered man, and they began to check on his associates, time was running out for Young and Radden. Ballistic tests matched the rifle Young had borrowed to both the affray in Frederick Street and the casings recovered from Trig Beach. The thread on the button found in the sand matched thread in a suit owned by Young, and some microscopic paint chips linked him to the scene as well. Early in February, first Young and then Radden were charged with the murder. The trial of Robert Young and Lyle Radden took place in June 1966 and lasted for 12 days. Near the end of the trial, Young spoke in his own defence for 65 minutes, blaming Radden for the crime, saying that Radden could have taken the unlocked car while he slept at Radden's house, although Radden did not have a driver's licence. and the rifle which was in the car without his knowledge. Young denied the blue suit, which matched the thread on the button found at the scene of the crime, was his, but that it had belonged to Peter Dawson. Young further claimed that he had bought Pascoe's watch, which he was wearing when he was arrested, in the bar of the Hilton Hotel in November 1965. The trial concluded on the 28th of June with a verdict of guilty by a jury of 7 men and 5 women. Justice Roma Mitchell pronounced sentence of death on both defendants. Neither man had anything to say in reply to the sentence, and they were led away to be housed in Adelaide Jail to await their fate. The trial had a number of firsts for South Australian criminal proceedings. It was the first time that a female judge had pronounced a death sentence. It was the first time that female jurors had convicted a defendant of murder, and the first time that shorthand writers were used to transcribe evidence. Less than 2 years previously, Glenn Saber Valance, aged 21, had been hanged at Adelaide Jail for murder on the 25th of November 1964. Although a Labor government had been elected to replace a Conservative government in 1965 with an abolitionist policy, there remained a chance that Young and Radden would hang. Premier Frank Walsh and his Progressive Attorney General, Don Dunstan, inherited a legal system which was firmly rooted in the attitudes of the 19th century. Also abolished with execution was whipping. People as young as 9 years of age could have received up to 25 strokes of a birch rod for such things as throwing stones, obscene behaviour, writing graffiti, or being a vagabond. Tribal aborigines could be whipped for making a false statement. Leg irons could be used as a prison punishment, along with whippings and bread and water diets. Despite having spoken for more than an hour proclaiming his innocence and trying to blame Radden for the crime, after the conviction and sentence, Young confessed that he had indeed been the man who shot Keith Pascoe dead. Young was scheduled to hang on the 6th of August, but the sentence was postponed until the 29th of August, while the government met to consider their stance. On the 18th of August, the Executive Council commuted the death sentences of both men to life imprisonment. Nobody has been legally executed in South Australia since 1964. Death sentences were still passed for murder, but routinely commuted up until the official abolition of the death penalty in 1976. Information on the lives of the people involved in this case are difficult to find. Even at the time of the trial, several witnesses had moved on and could not be traced. Errol Radden, the brother of Lyle, was later convicted of sexual offences against 2 young girls in Brisbane in 1984. He was still behind bars in 2014. As for the others, more than 50 years later, they have slipped into the dark corners of history.